it turns out this whole debacle was actually revealed through the lawsuit that was filed against the Trump administration's construction project. Okay, so the Ballroom proposal was the subject of this legal challenge by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And recently, as I referenced a little earlier, District Judge Richard Leon, who is a Bush appointee, by the way, he was appointed by a Republican, actually halted construction on the project as this legal case was playing out. Now, why would he do that? Well, it's because, Trump's legal team claims that public funds are being used to build the bunker only, and that private funds are used for the ballroom. If you look at the contract given to the developer in this project, the developer, by the way, who didn't have to deal with any bids when it came to being granted the ability to do this project, you'll see that the wording is, telling to say the least. It allowed for or made way for public funds to be used for the ballroom. So for months, the public has been told, according to this incredible piece written by the Dre Dossier, that's over at Substack. I highly recommend reading the entire piece. But they write that for months, the public has been told that donor money pays for the visible ballroom and taxpayer money pays for the underground. Two separate things, two separate streams. Don't worry about it. But the contract says something different. The contract does not say that. In fact, the scope language draws no boundary between above ground and underground, between ballroom and bunker, between the building and what the building is sitting on. The wall the administration keeps drawing in public is not actually in the document that governs the money. And as we know, the contract is everything. The contract will determine how the funds are used, which funds are used for which part of the construction, the ballroom or the underground bunker. And so that is the reason why the wording in the contract and the lack of clarity on which funds were being used for which part of the project is what led to this federal judge ruling that there should be a stop to the construction as this legal case plays out. Now, in the aftermath of this White House Correspondents' Dinner, the assassination attempt that took place, these GOP lawmakers are basically doing the best that they can to send Trump the $400 million. While, by the way, Americans, of course, are struggling with a pretty devastating economy. The economy wasn't so great to begin with. We all knew that. That's the reason why Trump won the popular vote. He claimed that he wanted to focus on doing something about inflation and affordability. But he came into office and decided to start a war with a country that has control over the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of our oil and liquefied natural gas, global oil and liquefied natural gas, transits through. That's also the strait that a third of the world's fertilizer is transported through. So as a result, we're already experiencing significant inflation that's only likely to get worse as this war plays out. And we are in a stalemate right now. We are dealing with a really difficult situation in which Trump is unwilling to admit defeat. The Iranians see this as a fight for survival. So this war is going to continue. And as long as this war continues, as long as there is no deal made to open the Strait of Hormuz, costs on not just the American people, but people globally will continue to skyrocket. Now, AOC was recently asked about the Ballroom project, and she gave us a hint about how there's some funny money taking place here. Take a look.
He demolished the East Wing of the White House, a historic jewel of the American people, and he started to build this ballroom long before any incident. He also promised the American people that this was going to be built with private dollars. And so the idea that they are now trying to change the rationale for this in retrospect doesn't quite add up. I don't believe that in an era where they are jacking up prices on the American people, when they are gutting everyone's health care, when people cannot afford to pay their rent and their mortgages, that we should be choosing our precious treasure, little treasure that we have in this country, to build an ornate castle on a scale of which is quite unprecedented and unbelievable without any sort of accountability to those funds. And I'm sure that anyone who believes in, these values of so-called waste, fraud, and abuse would agree with me on that.
So Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez is absolutely correct in the framing of her statement there, because if you put everything in perspective, look, if we were living in an economic situation in which we have a federal surplus or we have debt, but it's not, $40 trillion. If we were living in a situation in which we were not at war with a country that has control over the Strait of Hormuz, if we weren't dealing with a stalemate as a result of that war, I mean, maybe you can make the case that, yeah, look, the ballroom needs to be renovated. If you go through the proper channels and you do it appropriately, that's fine. I gotta be honest with you guys, I really don't care that much, right? But I do care when the federal government, when Congress, at the behest of President Donald Trump, cuts $1 trillion from Medicaid funding and then proceeds to spend like crazy on wars for Israel. Let's be clear about that. On military weaponry and military funding for Israel, for a ballroom and an underground bunker. I mean, this is obviously spending that is unnecessary. And how do you justify that spending given the fact that, in the name of cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, the federal government cut $1 trillion from Medicaid, thus robbing disadvantaged Americans from the only healthcare they had available to them? I mean, that is an injustice of epic proportions, if you ask me. When you talk about the rural hospitals that are harmed as a result of that policy, I mean, it's just unacceptable. It's infuriating. And so that's when it becomes a huge problem. And once you dig even deeper into this story, you get a sense of just how utterly brazen and corrupt our federal government really is. So let's get to the details on that, because it turns out that the contractor for the construction of this ballroom and underground bunker was able to secure a contract without having to deal with any bidding wars, right? This was a no bid contract. So there's more to it than that. So the contract for the construction of the ballroom contains a section about conflict of interest reviews, right? And so to prevent donations from being given to Trump for this ballroom that could lead to potential conflicts of interest, there's supposed to be a conflict of interest review. However, the review only checks for conflicts with the National Park Service. It does not check, oh my God, so crazy. It does not check for conflicts with the Department of Defense. It does not check for conflicts with intelligence agencies. Now, why is that important? Now, I have no doubt that Trump is going to take donations from his donors to help bolster the funding for this ballroom project. But the donors might be engaging in some pay to play scheme here. So what do I mean by that? Palantir, Bose Allen Hamilton, Lockheed Martin, Amazon, every defense and intelligence contractor on the donor list passed a conflict of interest review specifically designed to avoid looking at any of their conflicts of interest. So that's a huge problem, because again, that paves the way for pay to play schemes. This is corruption, plain and simple. So how did Trump get away with it? Well, he fired the Commission of Fine Arts in October of last year, in 2025, and then decided to replace them with loyalists, of course. That's a common tactic that you'll notice with the Trump administration. And then the body that reviews federal construction in Washington, which is known as the National Capital Planning Commission, was also gutted and replaced with loyalists. In fact, the new commissioners for the NCPC were sworn in on the exact same day they voted to approve Trump's project. It's amazing. And so the Trump administration also used a loophole to grant a no bid contract to Clark Construction to build the ballroom bunker project, okay? So they're supposed to be like, in order to save money for the American taxpayer, the reason why you go through a bidding process is to make sure that you get the lowest possible contract. You don't want to overspend needlessly on something like a White House ballroom, right? Or the underground bunker. But Clark Construction was able to secure this contract without having to deal with any bidding wars. Why is that? So they did use a loophole, the Trump administration did. And I want to give you some details about what that loophole is. So Clark Construction, the same firm building the ballroom, was handed a $17.4 million no bid contract to renovate the fountains in Lafayette Park. I mean, let's pause for a second. I'm gonna read that graphic from the beginning again, but I want you to come back to me. Why do we need to renovate fountains when we're $40 trillion in debt? We're having a conversation about renovating fountains. Listen, I'm one of those women who loves beautiful things like interior design. I crave getting new furniture every other month. I don't do it because I'm not insane and I don't have the money for it, but I get it. I get wanting to renovate things. We are $40 trillion in debt. We are at war with Iran. And at this point, who knows how much it's costing us? Pete Hegseth had to testify before the House Armed Services Committee today. He doesn't even know how much we're spending on this war against Iran. Disaster, absolute, complete and utter disaster. Why are we renovating fountains? Okay, but let's get back to it. So Clark Construction, the same firm building the ballroom, was handed a $17.4 million no bid contract to renovate the fountains in Lafayette Park. The going rate for the same job under an existing competitive contract was only $3.3 million. So how was this justified? How did they do this? What's the loophole? Well, apparently there is a loophole having to do with emergency. So let's say there's a natural disaster. There's a crazy hurricane, and the hurricane causes some very real damage to critical infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt immediately. Now, engaging in a bidding process is going to prolong the construction or reconstruction of whatever infrastructure or whatever needs to be rebuilt. So that loophole exists for those types of emergencies. But the Trump administration has decided to use that loophole in order to grant a no bid contract to Clark Construction, not only for the ballroom and the underground bunker, but also for the renovation of these fountains at Lafayette Park. Now, guys, I want you to understand that it would be a massive mistake for you to think that this is merely a partisan thing. Now, Trump is the most brazen about it on a federal level in the White House for sure. However, as a Californian, I have seen this happen again and again and again on a state level. I've seen it happen on a municipal level where suddenly there's no bidding process. You have these private contractors who get these no bid contracts. And you're like, why did that happen? And the excuse is always the same. Well, we needed to get it done right away. Oftentimes it's to secure these projects, these no bid contracts for friends of the politicians in positions of power. And in California, as you guys can imagine, we are dominated by the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party. So this type of grift, this type of graft happens all over the place all the time. And it's just another sign of how broken our political system really is, not just on a federal level, but on a state and local level as well. And this stuff happens when the media is asleep at the wheel, they're not paying attention to what's going on. And the American people, as a result of that, have no idea what's going on. But make no mistake about it, the reason why American taxpayers end up paying these insanely inflated prices and contracts for projects like this is because they find these, squirrely ways to prevent the bidding process to ensure that we're getting the best possible price for the construction of whatever it is that we're trying to build or renovate. So that's what's going on here. Anyway, I wanted to give you guys those updates because you're gonna hear over and over again that no skin off our back, who cares? This isn't being funded by the taxpayers, except it is. And maybe in the grand scheme of things, you don't think $400 million is all that much money. But I actually think that it's yet another sign of how easily Congress is willing to spend money on frivolous nonsense while cutting resources from tax-paying American citizens. I want Medicaid to be funded. I don't give a damn about the fountains in Lafayette Park. And I certainly don't care about the White House ballroom. I do care when we're expected to pay for it. I do care when we're being lied about it. And that's what's taking place here. And final thing I'll say is, there's a lot of people wagging their fingers at ordinary Americans who are conspiratorial about what happened during the night of the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Can those people at least acknowledge that the conspiracies stem from the fact that immediately after that alleged assassination attempt, Trump exploited that horrific event to push for funding, to push for the construction of the ballroom? I mean, someone allegedly tried to rob you of your life, and the first thing you think about is the ballroom? That's strange. And that's what fuels the conspiracies. And to be honest with you, a lot of conspiracies ended up not really being conspiracies. So I don't know. I don't know what the truth is when it comes to what happened that night of the, assassination attempt. What I do know though, is that Trump seems super motivated to build this ballroom and exploited what could have been a absolutely tragic and devastating event. Regardless of what you think of Trump, if he actually got assassinated, that would be incredibly dangerous for our country, period. He exploited that to push for the ballroom and underground bunker. It's amazing. And it makes me feel like we're not living in a serious country right now.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.